I'm going to show images of hypothalamic hamartomas. Hamartomas are congenital and benign masses composed of cells that usually occur on that location but are arranged differently. So it's like this messed up closet that should be like this according to some magazines. The cartoon refers to the seizure type with bursts of laughing that occur in hypothalamic hamartoma because it is so closely related to the limbic circuitry. Hypothalamic hamartomas can be very small, as you can see on this coronal T1 and T2 weighted image, or large, as you can see on this sagittal T2 weighted image. Because hamartomas are composed of normal cells, they do not enhance. And in a hypothalamic hamartoma, there are neurons and glial cells, and the higher the T2 signal, the higher the amount of glial cells. Hypothalamic hamartomas are also called tuber cinereum hamartomas. And the tuber cinereum is the part of the hypothalamus between the infundibular stalk and the mammillary bodies. And you can see on this sagittal MRI that there's also the optic chiasm. And I mentioned in the previous brain bit by bit that the hypothalamus is separated from the thalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus running from the interventricular foramen to the opening of the aqueduct. And you can also use the line from the anterior commissure to the posterior commissure, which more or less coincides as the landmark between the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So on the sagittal plane, you can divide the hypothalamus in a supraoptic, tuberal, and mammillary region, and the hamartomas arise in the tuberal region. Hamartomas can also be part of a syndrome, for example, Pallister Hall, which is quite rare with only 100 cases worldwide. And the thing with hamartomas in a syndrome is that it can teach you something about the pathogenesis. And in Pallister Hall, there's an identified protein, and we're going to talk about the protein in Pallister Hall a little bit. Before that, I'm going to go back to things I've told before, and that is that there's in the brain organization, proliferation, migration, and then organization, preceded by patterning. And the patterning means that each cell in the developing brain and in the brain needs to know where it is and where it has to go to. And this is done by different molecules. There's SHH secreted from the floor plate and BMP from the roof plate in the telencephalon and Wnt in other parts of the neural tube. So each cell has to sense where it is. In most books, it says that with hypothalamic hamartoma, there is a problem with the migration. But in my opinion, there's also a problem with the sensing and the patterning maybe. And the sensing where the cell is in this patterning is done by antennas on the cells, and those are these hair-like extensions on the cell surface. And they are called cilia, and there was a very nice article in Science 2006. And the group of ciliopathies, diseases where there's something wrong with this antenna of the cell, is growing and growing. And in these antennas, in these cilium, there are small tubules that are in contact with the microtubules of the cell. And with this antenna, the cell knows where it is, and it senses where it is, and it gets cues from the extracellular environment. You can compare the cilia a little bit with a flagella on an alga, but the cilia are much more complicated, as you can see on these electron microscopic images, and these are examples of cilia in a mouse neural tube. These are, again, mouse embryonic brain examples of the cilia in the cerebral cortex and the really long cilia in the hypothalamus. And in Pallister Hall, there's a problem with one of the proteins in the SH8 signaling pathway, and therefore the cell does not know exactly where it is and it does not move correctly where it should go. And this leads to hypothalamic hamartomas with microscopically all these islands, clustered small GABAergic neurons, and interdispersed there's some larger glutamate neurons. These groups of GABAergic neurons have this pacemaker-like firing, and they also excite the glutamate neurons, and the excitation of the glutamate neurons gives the seizures in hypothalamic hamartoma. Besides seizures, there are also cognitive disturbances, and the hamartomas do not always occur in the midline but might also be located off midline, and depending on where the hamartoma is located, the treatment is chosen. So it can be radiosurgery, surgery, or ablation. The hypothalamus is also very important in the endocrine system, and the posterior pituitary is an extension of the hypothalamus, and the anterior pituitary gets all the releasing factors from the hypothalamus. And therefore, I want to continue in the next brain bit by bit video with the posterior pituitary, the bright spot and ectopic neurohypophysis.